I'm Sandy Quinn, President of the Richard Nixon Foundation. Welcome to the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. We're live from Yorba Linda, California. Welcome to a very special panel today, marking the 20th anniversary of the formal state services for the 37th President, which occurred 20 years ago today. Our panel is The Age of Nixon, and we have a very distinguished panel to talk about Richard Nixon in retrospect. And I'm going to start with Mike Barone. Mike is with American Enterprise Institute. Mike Barone. Mike, you're right down here. He's a resident fellow at AEI, and he's a political analyst for the Washington Examiner and a Fox News contributor. Next is Bruce Herschensohn. Bruce, you know, from ABC commentator. And we have Richard Norton Smith, one of America's great presidential historians, and he has a new book coming out in November on the life of Nelson Rockefeller. Richard Norton Smith. Richard has been director of 5 presidential libraries, including the Reagan, including the Hoover, the Ford. He just finished completing the new Ford Theater in Washington, D.C. If you're there, please go see it. It's a terrific experience. And he did the Lincoln Museum in Springfield. So he's got quite a history with presidents and presidential libraries. Next is the great governor of California, Pete Wilson. Pete started with Richard Nixon in 1962, as I did, and that's where we met. He went on to be mayor of San Diego, legislator, U.S. senator for 2 terms, and governor for 2 terms. I didn't quite make all that. Our moderator today, syndicated radio talk show host Hugh Hewitt, who was the executive director of the Richard Nixon Library when it opened. Hugh Hewitt.
Thank you, Sandy. It is always a pleasure to be back at the Nixon Library, and especially with a panel like this that doesn't need much introduction but does know a great deal about Richard Nixon. 20 years ago today, the state funeral was a massively somber occasion. And Governor Wilson, you spoke there, so I think I'll start with you. In your eulogy, you said it's hard to imagine a world without Richard Nixon. For half a century, he played a leading role in shaping the events that have shaped our lives. If you are to explain to a 20-year-old who was not around when that happened why he had such a critical and enduring impact, how would you do that?
Well, it would take some time. It would take some time, but I think what I would say is that Richard Nixon came to office as a great relief to a great many people in both parties and established confidence in the American people that things were going to get better. And he did it both with specifics and with, I think, the confidence that he felt. You have to be an optimist to run for president. And I think he was. He had phenomenal intellectual gifts, remarkable memory, as we were just discussing. And I think that people were at once disabused of the illusion that this war would go on forever, the Vietnam War, not a popular war, and one that we did not seem to be winning, and that somehow there would be someone in command who knew how to manage, who knew how to set priorities, who would be fully capable of watching out for the interest of the American people, both domestically and internationally. And for that reason, he not only bestrode the world stage, but he did so with great confidence and with people internationally looking at him with the confidence that I think the voters expressed.
Bruce Herschensohn, you worked with him, that durability from 1948 through to the funeral 20 years ago, always pretty much on center stage, even during the period immediately following the resignation. What do you attribute that durability to?
His tremendous genius for foreign policy. He knew it like no other person I've ever known in my life, and I don't doubt that no one ever knew in their life anyone who was more knowledgeable than President Nixon. With him, it was a passion. He tried to, and I shouldn't really use the word tried, he achieved knowing every nation in the world, knowing enough about them to give him an important background on which he would study daily. He would study foreign policy daily, and he once gave his advice. One of the things that bothers him the most about some in political life is that they never take the time to think. They always have things to do. You gotta have time to think. And he tried, and again, he achieved most of the time, at least an hour and hopefully 2 hours a day that he could think. And he would say something like this, and I think I'm being pretty precise. Everything you might memorize on a Saturday, you might have to change on a Sunday, because you're talking about almost 200 countries in the world. They all have leaders. They all have leaders that can one day not be there anymore for one reason or another, and what could happen in one country because of the death or whatever it may be of a leader, or losing an election, whatever it may be, can change that country's direction very easily and very speedily, and you have to keep up with it. And he loved it. He loved the passion of keeping up with it.
Michael Barone, to last that long, though, you've got to have a sweet spot in the middle of the American electorate, something on which you can rely, a group, an ethnicity, whatever it is. Who was the Nixon voter?
Who was the Nixon voter? Well, the Nixon voter, you can say, was the Republican voter. Remember that Republican Party, the Eisenhower-Nixon ticket, as it was, won a solid majority. President Nixon in 1960. That was, when you round off the percentages, that was a 50-50 popular vote. But he was running at a time when the old party lines were not necessarily holding, and when we had gone through as a nation a certain number of tragedies. The assassination of President Kennedy in 1963. In 64, you still had a nation that had confidence in its leaders, but that confidence was ebbing. You had urban riots, even after the passage of the Great Civil Rights Act. You had campus rebellions, not least here in California. You had a war in Vietnam that seemed to be unwinnable, and at the same time had casualties of an order of magnitude 10 times higher than the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that we've seen the last dozen years. I think in some ways you can, if you want to visualize the Nixon voter, take a look at the birthplace house. This is a house built, we're told, in 1912 out of a set. What do you call it? It was built out of a kit. It was the sort of place that ordinary Americans lived in, even out here on the exotic West Coast. Nixon inherited the support of the Republican part of that electorate, and in his re-election, he expanded that to include 61% of the country.
Richard Norton Smith, you're a presidential historian with few parallels and equals out there. We were looking at that photograph of 20 years ago today. 5 presidents and their ladies. I think you pointed out to me the last time President Reagan really made a public appearance. They were all connected in Nixon, but imagine that just the differences between them and the career that he represented. How did he stitch together a career that was able to connect from Clinton all the way back to the man you've just written about, Rockefeller?
Well, each of them in their own way was his legatee, but he himself was a legatee. Before there was the silent majority, there was what FDR called the forgotten man. And it is Richard Nixon's, among other, lasting historical achievements to have borrowed the forgotten man for a Republican, basically conservative political coalition. By the late 1960s, the forgotten man wasn't the victim of Wall Street and dishonest bankers and people who ripped off the system in Frank Capra movies that the New Deal arraigned before the electorate to bring about political realignment. By the 1960s, there were people who looked upon Washington and not Wall Street as their adversary, who resented bureaucrats rather than bankers, who took umbrage at what they saw as social engineering by the federal government. You had millions of people, the Nixon voters, the prototypical silent majority, the people who stood out in those lines 20 years ago in the rain because they were moved to express their tribute to someone who gave really voice to their values. People in the late 60s wondered about the future of America, just as people in the early 30s wondered about the future of America. People in the 60s wondered about the decline of the family structure. They saw what they thought was traditional values under siege by a culture. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt realigned American politics around economic issues. Richard Nixon, in many ways, realigned American politics around cultural issues. And cultural issues are always going to be more emotional. They're always going to be hotter to the touch, which is one reason why I think Nixon then and even now is still a more polarizing figure than, say, FDR. But he ranks with FDR, it seems to me, in the 20th century as someone who brought about lasting change. And in some ways, to pick up off what Governor Wilson said, Richard Nixon matters because we inherit the world that Richard Nixon gave us.
I want to follow up and then have each of our panelists comment on your comment that those 5 presidents were each legatees of Nixon. Would you briefly talk about that, and then we'll ask the Governor and Bruce and Michael to comment on that.
Well, obviously, Gerald Ford would never have been president. He was not Richard Nixon's first choice for vice president. Had President Nixon had his druthers, John Connally would have been his vice president, but it was made very clear in the climate of the time that John Connally would not be confirmed by either House of Congress. You know, Ronald Reagan had a fascinating relationship. You could write a book about the Reagan-Nixon relationship. Reagan, who of course had been a Democrat, who had voted 4 times as a young man for FDR. Historians, we tend to look over our shoulders and not, down the road. I don't think you can exaggerate the importance of FDR and what Richard Nixon inherited from FDR. Nixon is both a transitional and a transformational president. He understood that before he could move the country to the right, he had to deal with the fact that there was still enough of the old New Deal coalition around and voting that he almost had to placate them. Look at the, quote, liberal side of the Nixon presidency, and there's a lot to look at. The fascinating question to a biographer of Richard Nixon is, what were his motives behind OSHA and the Philadelphia Plan and indexing Social Security benefits?
He also remade the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party. Governor Wilson, why do you suppose Democrats just absolutely loathed President Nixon during the periods of the intense partisan rivalry?
Well, the fundamental reason is that he beat them badly. And in part, you could say, well, he was the fortunate recipient in the first election of people's lack of confidence not only in LBJ but in Hubert Humphrey. And that's true. On the other hand, it is certainly true that when he beat George McGovern so decisively, it was because they decided that in the first term he had done extremely well, and really they might have thought McGovern a nice guy, which he was, by the way. But they had no confidence, and it was made even worse when he discarded his announced vice presidential running mate and then had to substitute another one. But basically, I think that Richard Nixon did have that kind of, it's sort of an interesting thing in a way. He was a California boy, born and raised here, but he had, in many respects, kind of a Midwestern affinity. We were talking about people who do have seemingly perfect pitch politically. And I think in many respects he did. He was conservative in that he did not trust the kind of engines that would lead to what we have seen today. Unprecedented growth in the size and cost of government. And at the same time, there were things that were happening that he thought needed a response. One that was appropriate to the time, though it has been badly abused almost ever since, was the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. He would be appalled today to see what has occurred. And I think, well, he'd be appalled at many other things. Cultural, Richard, to take your point. And I will say that he would not only be dismayed by the plunge to the left domestically that has led to this unprecedented growth in the size and cost of government, but he is also, I'm convinced, to take Bruce's absolutely valid point that his great passion was foreign policy. What is a far more urgent need and far more dangerous lapse on the part of the current administration is that they are so clearly out of their depth with respect to foreign policy and national security policy. It's interesting that the epitaph on his tombstone is that there is no greater honor than to be a peacemaker. But he understood, as did Reagan, who made it explicit, that to achieve peace and liberty with it, you had to exhibit great strength, not only objectively in terms of your capability militarily, but in terms of your resolve to use that strength if necessary.
Bruce, I want to go back to the animus because you lived it. What was its source for the people who just got out of bed in the morning wanting to beat Nixon?
It's hard for me to say, and I don't want to just take stabs at it because I really don't know. Obviously, I felt quite the opposite, and still feel quite the opposite. They want to take stabs at him. Is that what you're?
Yeah, well, yeah,
they're opposed to him so much.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think a lot of it, certainly in D.C., was that this was a man, even though he lived in D.C. for so long, the House, the Senate, Vice President, they never thought of him as a Washingtonian. They didn't like the idea of his party. I mean, you have to consider that D.C. is a Democrat town. It's when you speak of President Nixon getting 49 states, it's always one state, and the same thing is true with President Reagan, one state and D.C., one state and D.C., because they'll always vote for a Democrat. That's just the way that it is. I want to go back to the first question they asked you, that you said it's like those presidents on that picture. It's like a team. No, it wasn't a team. I believe this, that the similarity is that all of them, with the exception of one, believed in not speaking publicly against a sitting president. And generally, if they didn't like the policy of a president, and I certainly know this to be true of President Nixon, they would talk to the sitting president, either by communication of a letter or that they would talk to him on telephone, but by and large, in a written document that would be only for that sitting president. Now, the one person who stopped that was one of those that we talk about as being on the team of that picture, was Jimmy Carter. He immediately lashed into Ronald Reagan and the Strategic Defense Initiative. He was saying that he had ruined the possibility of a summit with Gorbachev. And it was very surprising to a guy like me to hear a former president speak ill of a sitting president. You don't do that. But
let's go back to maybe why '68 was such a pivotal year. Okay. Michael Barone, that was the closest election, the most hard-fought in the world coming apart. Did you see that kind of, I don't know if you were in the prognostication business then or if you were still working for Democrats as a pollster then, but did you see
even before that?
Did you see it coming?
Well, it's interesting, Hugh. I just took a look in preparation for this at some of the numbers crunching in the 1968 election and comparing it with previous elections. And what you see, if you just look at the Republican and Democratic percentage state by state, it looks very much like 1960. Of the two parties, they're both 50-50 elections when you round off the percentages of the major party vote. President Nixon runs somewhat better than he had 8 years before in the Rocky Mountain states, where I think Barry Goldwater had helped set up an appeal to the Republican Party and the old idea that those New Deal ranchers, you know, those ranchers and loggers and stuff that thought the big corporations were against them in 1960 and decided the big federal government was against them by '68. And things also look different in the South, and that was one of the big changes. The South. You had George Wallace running an independent candidacy, 14% of the popular vote rounded off nationally, carried 5 states. Without Wallace in the race, I think everyone has agreed that Nixon would have won by a solid popular vote margin and by a much bigger electoral vote margin than he received. And in 1972, we then see that Wallace vote going almost entirely to Richard Nixon. And by the way, not because he had practiced a Southern strategy of encouraging segregation. It was Richard Nixon's administration that integrated and desegregated the Southern schools, okay? And so, you know, it was not, Americans, including Southerners, did not want to go back to legally enforced racial segregation. Nixon moved us along as a country in the right direction on that, which was consistent with his previous record as an Eisenhower vice president and so forth. What you see in the period after '68 starts to look different. From '68 to '88, you've got 6 presidential elections, 5 of the 6 won by Republicans. Average popular vote margin as a percentage of the vote is 10%. The Republican lock in the president. You do get Jimmy Carter in there, a white Southerner, winning the vote in 1976 by a narrow margin. And I would just add to what Bruce said that it's my understanding that the complaints about Jimmy Carter speaking out against current later presidents have not been echoed just by Republican presidents, but by at least one Democratic ex-president who's still around and whose wife apparently is still in the politics business. In any case, in '68 to '88, you basically get a flipping of the historical preference. The white Southerners, totally, you know, 90% Democratic for 90 years after the Civil War, become more Republican. Not because they want segregation back, but because they're voting on those cultural issues that Richard mentioned, because they're voting on war-peace issues, and the Democratic Party has become the more dovish party, which it was not between 1917 and '67. So Nixon is a pivot to that period. He starts off in Congress, the 80th Congress, which he enters in 1947, was sort of the high point in Congress of the coalition of Republicans and Southern Democrats. They have been winning votes in Congress during World War II when the Democrats are nominally in the majority, and this with the Republicans in the majority. They make major national public policy, rejecting things like federal aid to education and public housing as the major source of housing in the United States, passing over President Truman's veto the Taft-Hartley law regulating labor management relations. The preceding year, 1946, had been the #1 strike year in American history. That was no more. It had been Southern Democratic cooperation. And President Nixon, as a political strategist, as president, seems to bank on that. Ultimately, that doesn't work for him on impeachment. The rules have changed in the political realm. He doesn't fully appreciate how the rules have changed, even though he's in the process of doing that, and trying to make what he thinks are positive public policies like the EPA.
Richard, in 1968, you've got people talk about divisiveness in politics today as being pretty extensive, but in 1968, the country is coming apart at the seams. And
Sure.
32 was a bad year to run for president or be president and be running for it. But was there anything like 68? The age of Nixon sort of dawns in the worst domestic strife?
Well, the curious thing is I don't think anyone thought it was the age of Nixon. I mean, like many things, it took time. And in fact, I think one of the remarkable things about 20 years ago was, for a lot of people, it just dawned on them. It was a bit of a shock that it took Richard Nixon's death, because it always seemed like he would always be there, for people to really reflect on his historical significance. And I think a lot of people just, Bob Dole said the second half of the 20th century will be known as the age of Nixon. You could certainly make the case that there is an age of Reagan as well. Probably only 2 or 3 other presidents, Jackson, FDR, who were entitled to similar recognition. How do you get an age named after you?
That's what I was going to ask.
It's simple to describe and almost impossible in our Madisonian system to do. You shatter the existing political consensus, the status quo, and you replace it with something quite different. Now, 4 years, let alone 8 years, is not enough time as a rule. Events have to speed up. Crisis helps. By 1932, a basically conservative country voted overwhelmingly against Herbert Hoover. And by the way, they got Franklin Roosevelt. And by 1936, they decided they liked the alternative. And then, of course, Roosevelt built the safety net, the welfare, kind of improvised the welfare state, and so on and so on. What Richard Nixon did, it seems to me, very shrewdly, was first of all win over, or at least diffuse, a lot of... He understood that for the Republican Party to become a majority party in America, a governing party, first of all, it would have to be a coalition. In any country as diverse as this, to be a governing party means you have people in it who don't agree with people about a lot of other things. Certainly the Roosevelt coalition was crazy quilt. Nixon was comfortable with that idea of diversity. Who did he pick off? The ripe fruit, the low-hanging fruit, were the old New Dealers, union members, people who watched All in the Family and who laughed with Archie and not necessarily at him. Millions of people who felt a cultural affinity for what Nixon represented. Millions of people who felt that the dominant media in the country were condescending toward their views. It's no accident that Fox News came out of some vacuum. Well, that was it in many ways. When you had 3 men sitting in towers in New York who, between them, commanded 95% of the television audience. And they were also a great foil for someone like Richard Nixon.
Governor, give a sense of when the phone rang and your assistant says, President Nixon, you're either in the Senate, or you're the governor, or you're a candidate. What did you think you were in for, and how did his mind work, and how would he go about dispensing advice? Because your rise to national influence occurs after he's left office. So a sense of how he would do that.
Well, I would expect to get some very good advice. He was I think it's obvious to anyone who spent any time with him that he had several passions. He was a talented man. He was a talented musician. He was a devoted baseball fan. Probably his second choice to being president would have been to be a sports writer. But in terms of public affairs, again, Bruce is right. He had an absolute passion for foreign policy. He was super knowledgeable about it, and but he also was a very shrewd, good advisor about domestic politics. And he would ask questions. What do you think of this? What are you going to do about this? And not on every occasion, but not infrequently, if you were smart enough to say, what do you think, Mr. President? He would tell you what he thought, and he would, sometimes by asking questions, try to point to something that he thought was best avoided, or if it was something that you felt you could not avoid and shouldn't avoid, then he would want to know how you were going to deal with it. And the conversations were always rewarding because he was always very thoughtful in both senses, both meanings of the word. But the thing that struck you every time you put down the phone after having one of those conversations is how thoughtful he had been and how forward-looking. I mean, I don't know that he was a chess player, but he thought in that fashion, several moves ahead. And if you were going to follow the conversation, you had to be capable of doing pretty much the same thing, or at least catching up quickly.
On that note, Bruce, he wrote a book called Seize the Moment after Russia fell apart, looking ahead, after the Soviet Union fell apart, looking ahead, seize the moment, trying to be 5 steps down the road. I'm sure he is disappointed with how we are positioned in the world today, but do you think he might have thought that inevitable given how Russia would have to return to its roots?
Again, Hugh, I hate to say it more than once, I don't know precisely what he would say, but I believe, or what he would say publicly or privately, but I believe that isn't as much the case as he would be disappointed in any number of things that have happened. A couple of these I know with certainty that he was already disappointed in. But most recently, disappointment with Russia and the People's Republic of China getting together. Remember, the purpose of that trip of going to China was for what he called triangulation. It was the idea of separating the People's Republic of China from the Soviet Union so that never again would they be intertwined together and then go against the United States. He wanted to keep it a triangle. Now it isn't very triangulation anymore because they are together. They're generally together in the UN. They're generally together on the side of our enemies. And that would be a tremendous disappointment to President Nixon. The other disappointment that I could say with absolute certainty, because this disappointment started when he was living, is the idea, let me put it this way. When I ask a kid or a young person, who was president when Vietnam and Cambodia surrendered? 9 chances out of 10, they're going to say Nixon. I've had some say LBJ. I've rarely had, there are some, but rarely someone say who it really was. Gerald Ford, he was president. And and if you ask why did they surrender, and this really hurt the president. They would say we should never have been there in the first place, or they would say the South Vietnamese weren't very good fighters, or that we didn't do a very good job. We should have just taken off, leave. He never felt that way, and the reason he never felt that way is because the South Vietnamese were great fighters. Our troops never lost one battle, and more important than anything else is why the surrender came about. And I'm going to make this as brief as possible because if you start going into detail, you go on forever. The 94th Congress would not give the aid that President Nixon promised in the Paris Peace Accords, that if North Vietnam ever violated the accords, that the United States would furnish on a one-to-one, piece-to-piece basis anything the South Vietnamese lost. The 94th Congress that came in after Watergate, after the resignation of the president, wanted to turn a victory, and it was the winning of the war. And I'm not quoting me, I'm quoting Bui Tan of North Vietnam. They lost the war. But then they realized when they tested President Ford, they could win what was lost because they would have to then test the Congress of the United States. They tested President Ford on a little village in South Vietnam. They took it. President Ford didn't do anything. Then they tested a larger village, then An Loc province. They realized they were going to win this thing, and the Congress wasn't going to do anything, and the president wasn't going to do anything. The president finally made an appeal to the people of the United States and the 94th Congress that if they don't follow the word that we signed, the United States of America, if they break that pledge, Cambodia is going to surrender, and so will South Vietnam. 1 week later, 7 days later, Cambodia surrendered. Then, on the 30th of April, we're coming up to an anniversary, the South Vietnam surrendered. That night, Senator Fulbright said, and I'm quoting with precision, "I am no more distressed than I would be if Arkansas lost a football game to Texas." And that was the feeling in the Congress.
Michael Barone, in 2012, although America is still deployed in a war, foreign affairs did not matter much in the presidential election. In Nixon's two presidential elections, it mattered decisively. Is that because Nixon forced the issue, or because the country's different now?
Well, it was because the issue was forced on Nixon. I agree with what Pete Wilson and Bruce Herschensohn have said about Nixon being a transformative leader on foreign policy. And he was placed in a very difficult position when he took office in January 1969. I mean, I think that is the third most difficult time to become president in American history, 1861 and 1933 being more difficult, with the Union sundered and with the economy collapsed. But it was a difficult time, and it remained difficult. Governor Wilson, I think, mentioned that people, young people today don't say that Vietnam, Bruce said, young people today don't remember when Vietnam fell. One of the curiosities of the whole Vietnam episode is that as president, Nixon was excoriated by most of the leaders of the Democratic Party on the Viet. People who had mutely stood by or supported President Johnson's escalation of the war and President Johnson's, in my judgment, poor judgment in continuing to support a losing military strategy under General Westmoreland, finally got rid of him for General Abrams late in his term, then excoriated Nixon for de-escalating the war and for getting what I agree with Bruce now was a successful conclusion. There's a certain amount of political hypocrisy in that. Political hypocrisy is not unknown throughout the ages, and sometimes some of us even have to admit that the party we root for does it occasionally. But it was quite a lot of chutzpah on the part of people that have been happy to support the war under a Democratic president, tried to undercut its success under a Republican president, and then when they got a majority of the Congress, and after the President Nixon's resignation in 1975, as Bruce notes, cutting off the fundaments there. So in that sense, President Nixon's presidency was not successful. And yet, as others have mentioned, he made lasting changes in American foreign policy. I mean, Bob Gates has said in each of his two memoirs that one of the things about American foreign policy is that it usually doesn't change as much from administration to administration as the political rhetoric suggests. And I think that's probably right. But on China, and also on the relations between Israel and Palestinians, It gets changed under President Nixon. China deliberately recognizing that there was real enmity between the Soviet Union and Communist China, something that the previous supposedly more sophisticated democratic foreign policy leaders had not really found out. He changes that foreign policy to a policy of engagement with China. Most successful presidential candidates since, with the exception of the first George Bush, have attacked that policy, and then when they become presidents, they followed it. Now it may be at least temporarily in some ruin because of actions or inactions by the current president, but the fact is a foreign policy lasting 40 years or so, longer than the length of time between 1914 and 45, is a pretty substantial achievement, and it turned that ship of state of American foreign policy that's hard to turn in a direction that proves to be lasting and on the whole, I think, productive, is a considerable achievement.
Let's stay on foreign policy for a moment, and I'll come back to you, Richard. President Nixon presumed to, and actually was, and said so, the leader of the West, the leader of the free world. Can any American president expect to actually say that unself-consciously going forward? That perhaps they're grasping a little bit too much for themselves?
Well, it becomes harder the further we get away from, in time, from the bipolar world that came out of World War II. You know, the debate over who won the Cold War. I used to hear President Ford say, well, every single American president, beginning above all with Harry Truman, every Congress of both parties that were willing to make the sacrifice, and above all the American people who were willing year after year after year. You know, 1960 is a year that lots of people look back on as kind of the ideal election. And in fact, it turns out to be the most aberrational election in American history. It wasn't really an election about anything. The two candidates couldn't really decide what it was that separated them.
It was the end of the 17th century religious wars between Protestants and
It
Catholics.
was the ultimate, it was a consensus country. Stop and think, we had been through the Depression. We had been through World War II together. We were in the midst of the Cold War together. Those shared experiences forged a political consensus that Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy very attractively personified. Now, you're right. The interesting thing is that both candidates, although they couldn't say it publicly, didn't care a whole lot about domestic policy, cared greatly about foreign policy. History will record that they were right in their choice of priorities. But they were part of a post-World War II era that by 1968 was already a thing of the past. And half a century since then, I don't know what the West is today. One last thing. I do think one key to understanding Richard Nixon, and there's anyone so complicated, you need a whole lot of keys to begin to unlock that door. But he did have a hero worship for Charles de Gaulle. And you found it expressed in so many ways. And something de Gaulle is really not kind of an American hero. We're all supposed to admire Churchill. You know, that's whose bust we put in the Oval Office. But think, when Nixon went up to Camp David, that was his Colum Day. When Nixon decided that he would not have a state funeral, but everything would be here in Yorba Linda, that was exactly what de Gaulle had done in Colum Bay. When Nixon repeatedly quoted Aeschylus about one must wait until the evening to see how splendid the day has been, he borrowed it from General de Gaulle. Even those Ruritanian uniforms in the White House Guards that survived about 2 weeks at the beginning of the presidency, that was a poor man's attempt to recreate the Élysée Palace. So I think, you know, when you speak of the West, de Gaulle, Churchill, that generation at its best, it was Nixon's great fortune when he put together the Great Leaders Gallery that you know better than anyone. Who was in it?
Golda Meir and Lee Kuan Yew, people you would not expect to find.
But
He
also,
knew everyone. But Mao.
And de Gaulle.
And de Gaulle.
The West.
Yeah.
That doesn't, who today would you put in the great leaders gallery?
Huh.
Can anyone name the premier of Holland?
Can anyone name the Mao of China today? Michael, I have a proposition, is that one of the legacies of President Nixon is that he fundamentally changed American media as well, in a way that has not unchanged, that up until '68, it was not as adversarial as it then became and grew increasingly so throughout the last 40 years. True or false?
I think that's true. I think that in part is a reaction to the Vietnam War, which many in the media soured on. Walter Cronkite proclaiming the Tet Offensive a great defeat for the United States, when, in fact, as we know from those who have looked more carefully at it, that it was a great defeat for the North Vietnamese. And they go into adversary mode. And, you know, that gets us into, you know, Watergate territory. President Nixon, I think, complained that the press treated transgressions made during his administration or in his campaign differently from how they had treated those similar transgressions in the operations of Franklin Roosevelt, of John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and so forth. I think he was factually correct on that. But the rules of the game had changed. And, you know, unfortunately, the political actors had to figure it out, and we get an increasingly adversarial press and an increasingly, and one that's operating as a partisan press. And
let me pick up on that with Bruce, because if you watch a White House press conference now, they're very sedate. They're very respectful. Is that how it was in 74, 73, 72?
No.
So what's changed?
No, it wasn't. The beginning of the Obama administration was very, very courteous to Obama. Just in the recent times, they have gotten slightly less courteous, or at least more what the media should be, I assume. And they've certainly been diplomatic and respectful, but at the same time, they've really been challenging quite a number of things recently. I beg your pardon?
There's a lot to challenge.
There sure is. There sure is. There sure is. And since you said that, Governor, I want to make mention of this. Your original question regarding the future. I could be tremendously optimistic, and I'll tell you why. It doesn't come instinctively, but it comes because of what I call the Carter example. He changed foreign policy dramatically from the predecessors before him. He suddenly took our friends and made enemies out of them, whether it be El Salvador or Nicaragua or Iran or Taiwan, and I'm leaving some out. But those were the major ones. Really abandoned our friends. I didn't think we'd ever get over it. I thought, my God, the whole presidency has changed. But something very changing happened, and it was called Ronald Reagan. Once you get a leader in who is really a leader and has those kind of traditional feelings about foreign policy and domestic policy as well, but certainly foreign policy, because that's what a president, that's the stuff of presidents. And when you get someone in like that, it can change like that. Remember that the hostages were released 33 minutes after President Reagan said, "So help me God," on the inaugural stand.
I want to talk, President Nixon was known to be willing to go immediately to the nth degree, as with the bombing of Haiphong Harbor.
You bet.
Mining. And that willingness to use force, President Reagan backed it up as well.
You bet.
Was Nixon different in kind, Governor Wilson, from previous presidents, or was that just a continuation of American projection of power that we are now not used to?
Well, I think that as I've been sitting here listening to this, it occurs to me that we had 2 Republican presidents, and possibly, if he had been given time, a third, Gerald Ford. But we had Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, 2 people who were fully capable of recognizing evil, of recognizing realistically that when your enemy is menacing you, you don't turn the other cheek, good Christians though they may be. And in fact, both, I think, were of a like mind. I mean, the bombing of Haiphong, the bombing of Cambodia. Nixon was an aggressive president in terms of foreign policy and national security. And certainly Reagan was. And that is what I think would appall both of them if they were to return today or look down and see the decline, not just in the respect with which this nation has been previously held, but also the decline in safety, because we are sending such false signals. At least I hope they're false. We are seeing someone who, in his first meeting with Putin, left it with the news that we were going to back away from treaty obligations on missile defense to Poland and the Czech Republic. Now, what signal does that tell you? If you're concerned about foreign policy, if you're concerned about national security, you do not want to project weakness, because weakness invites aggression. How many times do we have to find that out the hard way? And they both knew it, and they were respected for it. I remember my father saying something at a breakfast table once, and he said, you know, I don't give a damn if the Russians like us. They'd better respect us, and the only thing they respect is superior force and the willingness to use it.
20 years ago today, I think that's a line from Sergeant Pepper, 20 years ago today, but 20 years ago today, there was this amazing, the weather was ominous, it was overcast, it was windy. I'm sure Governor Wilson remembers speaking into just the strangest group, but there was a ghost here as well, a ghost named Spiro Agnew, who came in and no one quite knew what to do with him. I'm sure Loie remembers this very well. You didn't know what to do with him. And Richard, you're the historian, you're just finishing a book on Rockefeller. What was President Nixon trying to do with the Agnew? He was not here,
by the way.
Yeah, I know.
That ghost had been laid to rest elsewhere.
With the selection of Agnew, what was he thinking?
Well, but let's go back, because the remarkable thing is that Spiro Agnew felt obliged to be here 20 years ago today, notwithstanding all of the history that had transpired in between, notwithstanding the public humiliation, obviously, that surrounded his departure from office. Something in him felt drawn to this place and that occasion, which tells you something about the hold, not just the historical hold, but the personal hold that Richard Nixon had on even the unlikeliest people. Now, why was Agnew put on the ticket? He had been a Rockefeller supporter. If some of you may remember, in March of 1968, everyone expected Governor Rockefeller to announce his candidacy. No one expected it more than Spiro Agnew, who took the opportunity to invite all of his friends in the press into the governor's office to watch the announcement on national TV. There was one little slip-up, however. No one had thought to call Governor Agnew to tell him that Governor Rockefeller was not going to run. He was humiliated publicly, and John Sears, the great delegate counter, told me he was in Alaska that day. Nixon left nothing to chance. Nixon wanted Walter Hickel, who'd been a Romney supporter, to be prepared as a cushion. If Rockefeller announced, he wanted to be able to announce that he had Wally Hickel's support. Anyway, he called from Alaska, got Mr. Nixon, and said, get Spiro Agnew in for lunch right away. And Nixon was kind of reluctant. He said, well, he's a Rockefeller guy. He said, talk to him right away. By the time John Sears returned to New York from Juneau, which wasn't easy in those days, but nevertheless, not only had Mr. Nixon called Agnew, but they had lunch, and Nixon had discovered all sorts of previously unknown virtues in Governor Agnew. As he described it, he spent the whole lunch telling him what a lousy guy Rockefeller was. And that was probably his audition for the vice presidency. He was the Southern strategy personified, but not George Wallace's South. Remember, Spiro Agnew had been elected governor in 1966, running against a right-wing, racist Democrat named George Mahoney, whose slogan was, "Your home is your castle." Very subtle. And Agnew was seen as the liberal in that year's race. So, plus Agnew was the personification of the new emerging Republican Party, the striver, Greek-American. I think he was the first Greek-American. Suburban. I mean, this was where Richard Nixon saw the future of American politics.
Let's stay on that moment and go to you, Michael Barone. President Nixon's political instinct is often talked about, but that was part of it. The triumph in '72 was part of it. But so too was his speech in 1952 when Ike was going to take him off the ticket. And perhaps people watching at home don't know much about that speech, but that demonstrated a touch or an ability to trump circumstances more than almost anything else in his career.
Well, it was an adroit political maneuver. He had, as Richard points out from his biography of Governor Dewey, some support from Governor Dewey in that, I believe. You know, there was this story that Nixon was getting contributions that were being used for certain things, campaign or campaign-related events from a few rich people. Pretty tepid stuff, considering what we've learned about money in politics recently. I know Governor Wilson never had much to do with fundraising, but running, what, 4 statewide campaigns in California, you don't have to raise much money.
No. It's the worst part of the job.
Yeah, he was, Nixon was given the hint that he should remove himself from the ticket, and he decided not to, and he gave a speech in which he said, among other things, that he was not going to give back the dog Checkers, the Cocker Spaniel, because the girls, the 2 daughters, who were then very little girls, loved the dog, and he also, sort of lugubriousness, a lot of, this goes back to one of your questions, why did the liberals hate him so much? They couldn't stand corny stuff like that coming from a Republican. Maybe it was okay from a Democrat, but not a Republican.
It was Fowler versus Checkers.
Yeah, Fowler's okay, Checkers is no good. The dog speech is 8 years apart. And he also said that he'd welcome a disclosure of finances by all 4 national nominees. And President Eisenhower, who had gotten a special, then General Eisenhower, had gotten a special congressional law enacted, as I recall, or IRS ruling to have the profits from his book Crusade in Europe, or the royalties, treated as capital gains rather than ordinary income, was not at all eager for this kind of disclosure to be made. And the story that the journalist Murray Kempton tells is that Eisenhower is watching that with a pencil and a pad in his hand, and when Nixon calls for the disclosures by everybody, he breaks the pencil. Not happy. But he was kept on the ticket, and you know, it's part of the amazing political odyssey of Richard Nixon. 6 years before, he was hoping to make $4,000 a year practicing law in Whittier, California, and it didn't seem very likely. Age 33, about the time where you figure, I should be in the groove to whatever career I'm going to be successful in if I'm going to be successful. 6 years later, he's the United States Senator from what was then the 2nd largest state, and he's the candidate for Vice President of the United States at age 39. An amazingly fast rise. I think that's one of the things that appealed to him about Agnew. A similarly fast rise from obscurity as a suburban politician.
And he'd done it all on his own.
Done it all on his own, and so forth, and then rising up. Nixon had had the people in the 12th district come to him, some businessmen that wanted him to run, and he was happy to do so. But it was, I think that, does that make sense?
Very quickly, we all think of John F. Kennedy as the television president. Richard Nixon was the television president. Richard Nixon's career was made by that one speech in 1952, which did something overnight that no vice president ever did. Richard Nixon had a constituency. Richard Nixon invented the modern vice presidency that night because millions and millions of Americans bonded with him and poor Mrs. Nixon sitting in her Republican cloth coat, off camera, suffering the agonies of the damned as he went through and told everyone how poor they were. But guess what? To come full circle, that's the forgotten man. That's the silent majority. It was born that night in a television studio in Los Angeles. It's much more than Checkers, and it was to the end of his career. How many people watched the David Frost interviews with Richard Nixon? It was mesmerizing television.
Bruce, he gave speeches for which he's remembered, not just the Checkers speech, but the great silent majority speech, his resignation speech, his farewell address in the Rose Garden to the staff. They're all very memorable. And he was a very accomplished writer in retirement as well. So he was a terrific writer. That is, I think, part of his appeal, but you were part of that effort. How much of it was Nixon and how much of it was the murderer's row of Sapphire and Buchanan and our friend Ray Price and yourself and a young Ben Stein?
It was Richard Nixon. What he would do is ask all of the people mentioned, write a speech for me. He knew that Pat Buchanan was going to write a conservative speech. He knew that Ray Price would make more of a liberal speech. He'd go to Camp David with everyone's draft, he'd put them all on the floor, and he'd pick lines and then write his own speech. You were doing extremely well if there was actually one line that you could recognize as probably having come from something you thought. And that was very, very rare. But it was Richard Nixon all the way. But he wanted to get judgments from different people with different political views. And I think it was marvelous. I want to add one thing because I was very fond of and remain fond of the Checkers speech. One thing one reason you could call it corny is because we're looking at it from a 2014 perspective. That was in the mid-50s. Practically everything in life was, by our criterion of today, corny in the mid-50s. But exactly, but by God, the Frank Capra movies were great. And that was a good time. And that speech to me was very appropriate. And it was, look, I don't want to go on and on, but we have a tendency to take people out of their times and put them in the times that we live in and think, well, how come they did so-and-so? I could even take Spiro Agnew, who did some very, very courageous, good things. He was what a vice president really should be when the problems, before the problems started. But he was from the right part of the country, as you were mentioning, Richard. He was also what a vice president was supposed to do, sort of be the guy who really gives the fist and really says something. Boy, he really did give the fist, and he really did say something against the media of the time. That was a very brave and courageous thing to do.
Bruce, let me follow up with you and ask maybe the question I get asked most often about President Nixon. Number one question is, why did he not destroy the tapes? Yeah. Why do you think that is the case?
I'm afraid I know. He actually thought that they would be historically important, and from a legal sense, it was President Johnson who told him to retain those tapes and showed him the devices that he had and felt that this would be something that would be terribly important, as they were for other presidents. And here you just hit on something that bothers me to this day, and as long as I live, will be bothered by it. I truly, this isn't saying I have great respect for it because that's what you say. I have great respect for both John Kennedy and President Johnson. I think they were terrific people, terrific guys, and awfully good presidents. I do not feel that way about all of the people on their staffs in this way. when President Nixon got in the most severest trouble for things that happened in his administration that happened in every administration in my lifetime, none of his stats, look, remember that no former president was alive when President Nixon was going through the scandal in 1973 and 74. Well, that was a unique time in American history. Not one president was a former president. My belief is that if Johnson was alive or if Kennedy was alive, they would have supported him. Now, that's a belief. I can't say that with any certainty. But the tapes, it was thought by most Americans, well, this is the only president that ever did anything like this. And by God, FDR did it with a wiretape machine. President Eisenhower did it with his stenographic machine. JFK did it with the telephone and monitoring people. And LBJ did it. You can buy books of Kennedy's tapes now and LBJ's tapes. Can you possibly say that Evelyn Lincoln, his secretary, JFK's secretary, didn't know it? She was alive and well. And she should have, as a human being, and as someone who worked for a president, should have come forth and say, this is something that has been done for decades.
Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, let me ask you that. Why is it, on balance, that the Kennedy and particularly the Johnson tapes have served to burnish their historical reputations? I mean, in the case of LBJ, that's really his memoir. Those tapes show Johnson's mastery of the political process. So why is it that the Kennedy and the Johnson tapes have, by and large, enhanced their reputations?
Probably.
And at least thus far,
let me give you a guess.
That's not been the case with the Nixon
I'll
tapes.
have to give you a guess on this. Because the Kennedy Library and the Johnson Library went through the recordings and took out the ones that might have been harmful. That did not happen with President Nixon. We did not have the right to do that. That's why. And there were a lot of things that have been admitted to having said, but you never get a recording of it from those administrations.
Yeah, I don't know about the Kennedy, but I think I can actually contradict you. I think of the Johnson, all of the Johnson tapes.
All of them did? Okay.
All of the Johnson tapes.
Okay, then I take that back on Johnson. I'll leave it with Kennedy. May I just say one other thing, if I may, because you made a very good point about Nixon-Kennedy, the Kennedy-Nixon debates of 1960. And people think, gee, there was this great, they were really enemies. They weren't. They were extremely good friends. They were obviously running against each other in 1960. But right after the Bay of Pigs, President Kennedy calls up former Vice President Nixon and says, I'd like to talk to you about foreign policy. Former Vice President Nixon comes to D.C. and he's in the Oval Office, and President Kennedy is pacing. The former Vice President is sitting on a lounge chair in the Oval Office, and they're both talking about the events of the time, about Cuba, about West Berlin, about India and Pakistan, the Congo, Indonesia, and the UN, all of the stuff of the times. President Kennedy stops pacing, and he says, this is the stuff of presidents, isn't it? And President Nixon smiles and says, yes. And then President Kennedy says, I mean, who cares if the minimum wage is $1.15 or $1.25? And President Kennedy smiles and nods. Now, it isn't that neither one of them really cared. It was that neither one of them could really do much about it. That's the stuff of the Congress. And you got to give that to every president, unless he has a Congress who is totally in his pocket, as President Bush did, certainly prior to the time that the House of Representatives went to the Republicans. If he has his stuff in the pocket, then he can do what he wants domestically. Otherwise, it is continually up to the Congress on domestic matters. It has to be. And you've all heard President Obama appeal to the Congress, vote for this, vote for the stimulus bill. He went on and on and on. He was begging the Congress. And when you look at past presidents, I'll be real brief, Hugh, I promise you this. But when you look at someone like Bill Clinton, and he couldn't get his health care through. But by God, if he wanted to go to Bosnia militarily, we did. Kosovo, we did. I don't think there was one congressman who knew that we were going to do anything in Kosovo. If he wanted to send the Navy to Haiti, he did. If he wanted to send more troops to Somalia, he did. If he wanted to bomb Iraq to get rid of their WMDs, he did. 4 days of bombing, which no one ever brings up again. Clinton was right in doing that. That's what presidents can do without Congress. And President G.W. Bush, he wanted immigration reform, he wanted Social Security reform, he couldn't get either of them, but when he wanted to send troops to Afghanistan, he did it. And Iraq, he did it.
We do have about 20 minutes left. I want to cover two things in particular. One is the people that President Nixon brought with him into government, because Governor Wilson, he had the smarts to hire you, and he hired me once, and he hired Bruce once, and he hired Brennan and Dwight Chapin and Lowy, so there are a bunch of people here who think that he hired smart people. But his administration
Should we quit now and not disabuse them of that?
And Henry Kissinger and George Shultz and Daniel Patrick Moynihan in the White House and Ray Price, you've staffed administrations, you know how hard it is to do that. A word or two about how he found people and the people he went looking for.
Well, I think he was looking for people whom he could trust as to their judgment, as to their sense of duty, and as to their discretion. And he had a lot of people who were eager to work for him, who admired him, and who wanted to be part of his administration, accomplishing the things that they believed in. And he, fortunately, I think for him and for those of us who had the good fortune to be associated with him, a lot of the people upon whom he relied were good at personnel and could say, you know, Hugh Hewitt did a good job for us, and we ought to keep him close, and we ought to give him something else to do. And that's, I think, one of the great advantages. One of the great advantages he enjoyed is that he inspired tremendous loyalty. And you got the impression, if you were a lowly minion, but had some contact with him, in my experience, I never heard anyone say that he was anything other than thoughtful, kind, that he expressed interest in people individually, and not surprisingly, he inspired loyalty. Not just respect, but personal loyalty, and valued it, as anyone should. So I think that he was surrounded by people who felt that loyalty, who felt inspired by him, and so it was his option to encourage them and to pick the best to help him achieve the goals that he had set.
Michael Barone had a prodigious memory, an extraordinary memory, and the governor's nodding. When I worked for him in '79, he sent me out to Palm Springs, and I ran into a woman who said to remember her to the president, and he remembered it from a 1952 campaign spot that they it was extraordinary. Do people have to have that anymore in politics in the way that they used to have it?
Well, that memory of remembering names and faces and putting them together, I mean, President Bill Clinton has that kind of memory, I gather. I mean, Kendrick Mead was a congressman from Miami, African-American, ran for the Senate unsuccessfully, but in the 2010 cycle. But President Clinton remembered him from the time he had been a state trooper driving him from around one Florida campaign stop to another when he was a governor. So it's the same kind of thing that you cite on President Nixon. That's an unusual quality, and obviously, you know, I gathered that he had a memory for counties and how they had voted and who was the county chairman. I can't see anything remarkable about that. I have a memory for counties too, but doesn't everybody?
Yes, New Jersey is remarkable too.
Yeah, no, it's there's only 3,141 of them, so it's not hard to keep track. You know, he did have that tremendous memory. He had, you know, as I said, he was in a period when the presidency was, when political alignments were changing. And I think the interesting thing is not, you know, that he sometimes was wrong about where things were going. He tried to win a majority. He really didn't make an effort to win a majority for the Republican Party in the House of Representatives. He thought that conservative Southern Democrat and Republican coalition would be enough to support him and his programs. I think he was wrong about that. But he saw many of the other changes that were taking place and helped put them into effect. So he wasn't right. The question you asked earlier about his appointees, one of the things that I still can't figure out, and perhaps others on the panel have better insight into this than I do, where did he get the idea of picking up two Harvard professors like Henry Kissinger and Daniel Patrick Moynihan, both of them in their different ways brilliant, but Moynihan, a liberal Democrat at the time, Kissinger, a Rockefeller family retainer, and so forth, not political allies of Richard Nixon, that he was able to use their ideas. The China opening, we know, was originally Nixon's idea. He mentions it in his Foreign Affairs article in 1967, before he ever met Henry Kissinger. Where did he get the idea to do that?
Well, the only thing better than definitively defeating Nelson Rockefeller for the leadership of the Republican Party in the free world was defeating Nelson Rockefeller and then taking his foreign policy advisor
Not his wife.
away from him. No, that's another book. But remember, there's this side to Nixon. We forget, in 1960, he picked Henry Cabot Lodge to be his running mate, which today seems, again, classic, going to your point, you have to immerse yourself in another time, another
Henry
culture,
Cabot Lodge,
another set of
in the Eisenhower
expectations.
administration, when given the choice of White House Chief of Staff or Ambassador to the UN,
But I
chose
mean,
the
there was
UN.
still
Would
an
anyone do
Eastern
that today?
establishment wing to the Republican Party, and this poor kid from Yorba Linda probably paid more attention to it than it deserved even at the time. His first choice, of course, for vice president was Nelson Rockefeller. And when he couldn't get Rockefeller, he took Henry Cabot Lodge, who may be the only vice presidential candidate in modern times who actively subtracted votes from the ticket. The debate goes on, either candidate Lyndon Johnson helped. Henry Cabot Lodge, I think, is the only one who actually demonstrably hurt.
I want to ask, as we get down here at the last few minutes, the war, Vietnam, and I'll start with you, Bruce. We know the personal toll that the war took on W, and we've seen it about LBJ and his suffering over the war. What kind of a toll did Vietnam, if any, in your opinion, take on Richard Nixon?
Tremendous. Tremendous. I can say this with absolute certainty. He was devastated by what the 94th Congress did in stopping the aid. He felt, and of course this is true, that when a president signs an international document, the coming president does not rescind it. The coming president, the president's signature is not the signature of a man, it's the signature of the nation. And one of the clear examples, that just because it was so recent and so obvious, is what did happen in the Reagan administration, because what Reagan did during the campaign against Carter, he talked against the Panama Canal treaties, criticized it night and day. He also criticized President Carter for giving diplomatic relations to the People's Republic of China and cutting relations with Taiwan. However, when President Reagan became president, he did nothing about either of the two, nor would he do anything about either of the two. I think President Reagan was right both times. Right to be critical during the campaign, right to realize that the people of the United States signed those two agreements, and by God, we got to stick to them. And that's what a president is supposed to do. President Nixon believed he was devastated by what happened by the 94th Congress. He was even devastated to the point that he used to say about ending the war in Vietnam, that he wanted to end the war. In the latter years, he would never use the phrase end. It's the phrase that President Obama uses on a daily basis. President Nixon felt that you cannot ever end a war. You can only win it or lose it, after he saw our own side violate the agreement that he signed, and therefore causing the surrender of our allies. I asked him, what would you do if you were still president and the Congress stopped the aid? It wouldn't do what you promised would do. He said, I'd bomb them, no hesitancy. I'd bomb the blazes out of Hanoi and Haiphong again. He said, probably that would impeach me too. He said, but so what? I would have saved millions of Southeast Asian lives.
All right, my last question for everyone. I'm going to start with you, Michael, and come this way. Downstairs, we were talking about books that you two have written. You wrote a book about the Glorious Revolution that is in the 17th century, and Richard has written about presidents long ago. And books we were reading, like Lynn Cheney's new on Madison. 200 years from now, do you think people are going to be looking back and thinking Nixon is interesting enough to write about? And if so, why? And I'll just come down here and ask. And Richard, you have to come up with the subtitle of that book at the end. Go ahead.
I think that, yes, I think people will be interested. I think that they will, I think in particular the changing alignment of the United States towards China, which has, even greater significance today, with China being the second largest economy in the world now, an emerging military force. This has been an enduring achievement in American foreign policy that's lasted a long time by any standard. It has been accepted. We'll see how long it's sustained. I think it's a very major achievement, and it's, I have this secret theory about Nixon that at some level Nixon's ambition before he was asked to run for Congress was more in the line of being a New York lawyer who would go into government like Henry Stimson in foreign policy or something like that. If each reversal he moves to New York again after he loses the governorship of California, after the exile in San Clemente. He pursues his interest in foreign policy in an intellectually serious and sustained way. But I think that he will be of interest.
Bruce Herschensohn.
Yes, I do. I find that right now, the opinion of President Nixon varies considerably year to year. Went through a period where he was going around the world after resignation, talking to foreign chiefs of state. And the American opinion seemed to go quite high up. Then down, up. Right now it's on a downer. And the reason it's down, I believe, and that obviously would bother me tremendously, I find this to be true, that many Republicans publicly criticize President Obama. I'm one of them, for that matter. So what? What is that some Republicans want to prove their nonpartisanship, and to do it, they'll compare it with President Nixon and Watergate as, well, this isn't as bad as, and they won't say President Nixon, they'll say Nixon, and this isn't another Watergate. They say this not because they know anything about it, because they're probably, look, the president has passed away 20 years ago. He resigned 40 years ago. The election with Kennedy was over a half century ago. And so they don't know every bit of information they have on Nixon. I'd say 99% of the population is secondhand. They got it from others. The others got it from a media of NBC, CBS, ABC, Washington Post, New York Times, Newsweek and Time, all in the same liberal basket, and the syndicates of those newspapers as well. Therefore, they're not just getting it secondhand from people who really know their stuff, they're getting it secondhand from a generation that heard it secondhand of themselves. It would be like us right now having a media where you turn on television and it isn't Fox, MSNBC, and CNN anymore on cable. It's three networks all taking one political position. And that's the way it was in every major media. So when I hear otherwise good people being critical of President Nixon right now, and I do hear it, I hear it quite a bit lately because of this criticism of President Obama. I recognize they don't know what the devil they're talking about. And they don't. They don't. They've heard it all secondhand. And I can't accept that. They don't really know.
Governor
Even
Wilson?
even Woodward and Bernstein, to my knowledge, and correct me, Dwight or Jack or Lloyd, if I'm wrong on this, to my knowledge, never stepped inside the Nixon White House, yet wrote books about President Nixon during the White House years, with many, many, many flaws and inaccuracies in those books.
Governor?
Well, your question, Hugh, evokes the famous, whether it's true or not, the quote attributed to Voltaire, that history is a trick we play upon the dead. That's a fairly cynical view, whatever its accuracy. The thing that troubles me, and I think would trouble Richard Nixon if he were suddenly back here and able to assess the America of today, I think he would be deeply troubled, as I am, by how little the American people know of their own history. And that's not the fault of the 18 to 29-year-olds, the millennials. It's the fault of the people who have been running the public schools in this nation. And I hope that Richard and Bruce and Mike continue to write and defy Voltaire with histories that are, I must admit, my chief avocation. But it's essential if we're going to have people who are prepared not only for the job market of today, but that of tomorrow, that they have the skills necessary, but that they've got some basic, clear understanding of their own history in order to be responsible citizenship. Because we've made it very easy to vote, easy to register, easy to vote, but most people go to the polls pretty damn clueless. That's a tragedy.
I'm going to give the last word to the historian on my right. 25 years ago, when we built the Nixon Library, and President Nixon intimately involved in every detail of it, Richard Norton Smith came out and helped us at the President's request think through some of the issues. And I don't know if you can remember you telling me this, and that's always licensed to make stuff up, but I'm not making this up. I asked you if you would write a biography of Nixon ever, and you said, oh, hell, no, I would fall in and I could never get out. And explain that, and whether or not someone will come along, because I actually don't think a great Nixon biography has been written yet.
No, it hasn't. We're waiting for it. When Richard Nixon died, there was a cartoon in the Omaha World Herald, and the cartoonist, whose name escapes me, depicted history as an artist, and surrounded by the American people watching history, who was obviously going to draw the definitive portrait of this giant who had always been part of our lives. And the caption, history, the artist, says to everyone, sit down, wait a while, this one's going to take longer than usual. And 20 years later, I think the drawing is still very incomplete. Richard Nixon famously said that it would be 50 years before anyone could write about him with objectivity. He didn't say when the clock started. So he left himself a little bit of leeway there. Sandy was kind enough to mention that I was involved in designing the new exhibits at Ford's Theater and the Education Center in Washington. And the centerpiece is a 36-foot tall tower of books, unfinished, to make the point that the last word about Abraham Lincoln had not been written and probably would not be written. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say the same thing of Richard Nixon. 20 years on, I think this is a great interim assessment. But you're right, it's a Shakespearean story. It's a story not only about, I think Tom Wicker, oddly enough, came closer than anyone else when he wrote a book called One of Us. Because just as it took Richard Nixon, the veteran anti-communist, to vault the walls of suspicion and open up China to the world. So oddly enough, it took Tom Wicker, a pretty conventional New York Times liberal, to understand, however imperfectly, that special emotional and cultural bond that existed between Richard Nixon and millions of people who might not think of themselves as card-carrying Republicans, but who were part of the silent majority. And so it's their story as much as it is Richard Nixon's story. They're inseparable. It's our story. It's the country's story. And obviously it's a story with a global implication. And it's an unfinished story. So that's one reason why I think for anyone, first of all, I couldn't imagine doing less than 3 or 4 volumes. Well, find a publisher who will publish 3 or 4 volumes.
Forget it.
You see? I mean, he won't read them, and so I can't write them. And you're talking to someone who's just finished 14 years with Nelson Rockefeller. So the idea of 3 or 4 volumes, I think Richard Nixon is the most protean figure. That's what Bob Dole had in mind when he said the second half of the 20th century would be the age of Nixon. And to do justice to that large a figure would take an awful lot more time and energy, I'm afraid, that I have left.
And on that note, which cannot be topped, please thank my panel with me. And welcome back, Sandy Quinn.
Thank you, Hugh Hewitt. Thanks to this distinguished panel of great Americans for talking about Richard Nixon 20 years later. I want you to say hello to the president's younger brother, Ed Nixon. Please stand, Ed. And also to the president's Marine military aide, Colonel Jack Brennan, who is with us today. Thank you all for coming. God bless America, and God bless all of you. Please come back. Thank you.
Richard, I might read